You're not cheating on your wife if you eat my lemon square.
Your lemon squares taste like ass.
And welcome back to Horror Queers Hangouts. We are into the month of June, which means that we are unofficially celebrating Pride, since I feel like all of us just celebrate it all the time. But we thought we would talk about the current state of queer horror. So we are joined by Terry Mesnard, as well as Dani Bethea. And we are, just kind of opening the floor. I'm looking at this as a bit of a continuance of our conversation that we began with like Michael Verratti on the 100th episode of Dead for Filth. And that was a couple of years ago. So Trace and I were just kind of curious to say, have we come any further? Have we seen any changes?
Well, it's interesting too, because what's the bridge between these two dates, right? It's the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So what changed during the pandemic, if anything, right. to the status of queer horror?
Goodness.
Yeah. So who wants to kick things off? How are we feeling about the current state?
I saw a eye roll from Terry and a gasp of exasperation. So I'm curious what that is.
Oh, no, mine was more like, I can't believe it's been 2 years since we did the Michael Verratti thing and the pandemic was here.
Go ahead.
I actually think we are in a better state than we have been recently. Overall, as like as in a general kind of state of things. I think that we're seeing a little bit more in the mainstream areas. I think we're starting to see, I honestly, covering festivals this last year has been kind of like every festival, there's been at least one, if not more, queer horror, either directed or starring queer characters or about queer characters. And I think there's been a couple more transgressive things coming out too. So as a general, I think it's not great, but I think we're a lot better than we have been.
I think it's a thing too. I like what you're saying about mainstream, because to me, it's like, I think in the mid 2010s, we were seeing a lot of indie horror. Again, like your festival hits, we're doing queer horror. We're starting to see it more in mainstream, not really theatrically released. But since the pandemic, and now we're having more of these day and date releases, like we're seeing a lot more streaming content, streaming horror films go queer. And I'm like a mixed bag on it, because sometimes I'm like, oh, I think this is really good. But then sometimes I feel like that the queer content is geared or targeted towards straight audiences to be like, look, we're not that different from you. Right. And those are kind of when I have issues. Like I get why they're doing that, because they're the majority of the audience. But I'm also kind of like, but it reeks of, I don't know, it's like a little, I think didactic is the term I'm looking for, where it seems like it's just a little bit too explainy.
I know that there's a lot of obviously overlap with, obviously, I think we're not just going to be talking about movies, we're going to be talking about television as well. Yes, so it seems like TV and movies have always either been like neck and neck or like been like a scale. And it seems like the scale seems to, like you mentioned, like be tipping towards streaming and definitely be tipping towards television that people can watch. So there seems to be like, and it's funny, like, whenever you say like there's a ton of stuff out, it's just because there was never like a lot to begin with. Whenever there's just like a cavalcade, you're like, look at all this stuff. So like there's that new Netflix show that's coming out, what is it called, like First Kill or First Bite, the vampire one that everybody's like, ooh, interesting. Let me see, there's another one I'm thinking of, it's currently out now, it's on Sci-Fi, it is called Astrid and Lily Save the World. I don't know if y'all have heard of that one.
That one's more of a like middle grade one.
Yeah, but I know like the babies need something. Like I get it. Like all of this is like at levels, and I think it's really important that sometimes as adults, like we don't forget, like, well, what do the kids have to watch? Like, do they have anything? You know?
Right.
I'm glad that you mentioned TV though, even because so tiny anecdote, but it has a point, I promise. So I was playing Trivial Pursuit on the Switch last night with my husband, and one of the things is like, oh, like, which of these series finales had the most viewers? And it was like, MASH, Seinfeld, Friends, whatever, all this stuff. And the most was MASH with like 105.4 million viewers. And I was just like, I knew that was the answer, but I was like, I can't imagine 105 million people watching something now, not only because obviously there's a lot more available. Well, actually, that's it. There's so much more available. So we have all these smaller like niche audiences, but again, then we see, well, that's why Netflix cancels a show after one season, because it doesn't find the audience. And so I feel like it's so much more difficult nowadays for streaming audiences to get that audience. And I mean, again, we've seen it with Netflix with shows like Santa Clarita Diet or things like that, which I think super queer, but you can read it as queer.
Yeah, like we still haven't gotten a follow up to like Nurse Ratched.
Oh yeah,
right. Like that.
Where's that been?
I have no idea. I guess I don't know. Maybe the pandemic swallowed it up. Maybe too many conflicts, COVID conflicts. Maybe like.
I mean, I feel like every week I'm adding 3 new shows to my, I got to watch this at some point list.
One I really need to catch up on, but I've been trying to keep up with Los Spookies. I've been trying to keep up with that one. Like does that have queer content? Yes, it does. Yeah. So like, and I was like overjoyed to find out that like quite a, I don't know, what would you say? Quite a offering from the rainbow, as it were. Like I found out, I was like, oh snap, a male ace character. Like I don't know if I've ever. I'm like,
I've been seeing a lot more asexual representation actually in media. Legends of Tomorrow, before it got canceled, had a really good asexual representation, and I just saw something else too, where I was like, oh, I just never see that very often. So good for them.
Well, and even on the indie side, but Something in the Dirt, the latest movie from Benson and Moorhead, has a gay character and also a character that doesn't explicitly call himself ace, but is ace pretty much.
Very ace,
No, do you think that, because again, for me, when it's like, okay, yes, we have the festival, your indies and your streamers, those don't depend on box office. And I think that's why we're not seeing mainstream so much. Like I was even thinking with, the new the they/them that's coming out, I was like, but that's doing Peacock. So I was like,
Well, I think to me that signifies that there's a desire to be seen as representative and diverse. Like I hesitate to call queer content like a diversity hire, because I think that intrudes on more of like a racial politics stance, but it does sometimes feel like we're being checkboxed, right? Where it's like, okay, is there a queer character in here? Preferably somebody hot, but we don't want them to be too sexual, and they sort of work out those details. So they get like, well, let's get a Latino character, and then maybe we'll make them one of these other sort of like marginalized groups and so on. But so I feel like they're doing that in Hollywood, but then they're also saying, but if we can put this content into things like streaming or VOD or day and date, then we don't have to worry as much about offending. Like, I mean, we're still in an era, and I know this isn't horror necessarily, but we're still in an era where like Marvel expects like plenty of celebration every time they introduce a new queer character or their first queer character.
And it's in quotation marks.
And it's 6 seconds so that they can cut it out so that they can get the box office in places like Saudi Arabia and other places that are going to ask them to censor it. So like we're still very much in that space where it's like celebration in North America and other sort of like progressive parts of the world, but looking to censor and still make a buck in other parts.
But at the same time, again, I'm going kind of outside the horror umbrella here, but like when we're getting queer stories, we're also getting a lot of the same queer stories. And so like I'm watching season 2 of Euphoria right now, and I just got to the backstory of McSteamy's character, and I was like, oh, like I find it very interesting, but also how many times have I seen this before? Like closeted rich white guy like has becomes really angry because he has to be closeted. Like, again, makes sense, but I'm also like I've seen this story 1,000 times before.
Well, please let's let the white cis gays have another like story of tragedy.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
We've never seen it before.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, and I'm glad we're kind of gonna branch off from the horror umbrella, because often, sci-fi and fantasy and comic books, as you mentioned, like are right alongside. So I know a lot of people are incredibly heartbroken, myself included, that the CW is just chopping shows. Like
but the Flash is fine.
Yeah,
the Flash will always be fine.
I think Superman is okay, but Batwoman had to go. Like,
of course.
But, the 2 queerest shows they had, Legends of Tomorrow, which was 90% a queer character cast now, and Batwoman, which finally found its footing in season 3.
Yes.
Out. But I think there's more going on there than, I mean, it's just coincidental that it's the queer content. But then, a week later, they canceled like 6 more shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I wanted to kind of piggyback off what you were saying, Joe, earlier, that yes, I think we're seeing a lot of like maybe queer characters, or maybe not, again, diversity hires, but then also, last summer, what was one of the biggest things that for us horror fans was Fear Street, was the 3 weeks of Fear Street.
Yeah.
And that was an unapologetically queer story all throughout. And yes, you know, it's still some of the kind of tropes we've seen about like all the horrors coming from the actual queerness of the characters. And that's kind of what they're fighting against, particularly as it gets back to the 1666 time. And it's about the witch trials and a queer woman who was destroyed and, you know, that kind of stuff. But like, that was also a huge mainstream hit to the point that some of my coworkers who do not like horror ended up watching it and were like talking about it.
But at the same time, though, it was a bit anachronistic in a way, in that, like, because again, it's set in 1994. The first one is the main character didn't have, it's gonna sound terrible, as many problems as I would have expected for a queer. Which I'm like, I can see why some people might view that as a bad thing, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, but I'm happy to not see this typical story again, even though it's realistic. I just don't care to see that again in my Fear Street movie.
I mean, you know, as someone that was deeply closeted in the 90s, I don't want to see that story anymore. Right? I'm tired of rehashing it and kind of re-traumatizing myself through it. So if they want to take some liberties with, and another liberty was them complaining about the music that was released in 1994. And I'm like, whatever. Okay. But I feel the same way about the kind of like laissez-faire attitude toward queerness in it. Yes, if this were a gritty look at 1994, none of this would have happened. But I'm happy with that, and I'm happy that we're actually getting stories that you know, kind of bridge that sort of like teen horror. I mean, this is kind of gory and kind of reaches into our territory, but like it's stuff that I would have loved to have seen as a kid.
I have a question, actually, and this is something that Joe and I discussed several times in the podcast. But when It Chapter 2 came out, that the opening scene of that movie, which the gay bashing, had a lot of flack. Me personally, I was like, I'm fine with this. This is realistic. But I'm interested in y'all's thoughts on this, because I wouldn't call this movie queer horror, but it opens with a hate crime against a queer character.
You know what? You're absolutely right, because as the film went on, obviously that it was not out and out stated by Pennywise, but he was like, I know your secret. Like, I know, you know, that you have this internalized hate. And, you know, it's just like, really, Pennywise, is that necessary? But then again, you are like a hate.
He kind of feeds on it.
Like you're like a void. You're just a void that like sucks in all of the pain of like everyone and everything. So I'm like, okay, I kind of get it. But you're absolutely right. That was, because it was there and it was like violent. And I think we haven't seen anything like that in like media in a long time.
Mainstream media, I think. I've seen some
mainstream.
Really,
you're right.
Yeah, and I know people, and queer people that were like, I wish I would have known that was there because I probably wouldn't have gone to see the movie. And I get that, but then the one that complaints that are like, I wish that this wasn't in the movie. Like this doesn't need to be here. I'm kind of like, I don't fully agree with that assessment.
All right, Terry, go ahead, because you were the one who had like the most visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is one of my favorite books. I've read it, I don't know, a dozen times probably since I first found it. And it was like, for me as a very closeted, again, queer kid, finding this book that had a lot of queer content in it. Unfortunately, a lot of it was bad, but there was like queer content in it. It was something that I held on to when I didn't have it represented in real life. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to that opening scene. I think it was handled incredibly well and it was very impactful, but the book kind of goes into it a bit more and talks about like the history of violence towards minority groups, including queer people. And it makes it more of a point to discuss that and dissect it and kind of show the aftermath of it. Whereas in the movie, it felt like a shock treatment. It felt like just
we're opening
kind of,
the film with this, and then we don't really need to address it that much.
Right. And I felt the same way. In fact, like I think Wrong Turn 2021, the remake, is actually a surprisingly good film, but it bothered the hell out of me that most of the two queer people are used as basically the emotional punching bags, where it's like the first major death is the tree coming down the hill, and we get like a good 5 minutes of them crying over their queer character. And then arguably the person that gets it the worst is the other queer character who is has his eyes poked out, is sent to be a cannibal in these caves, and then eventually has to be murdered, put out of his misery. And that kind of bothered me because you had the two queer characters and it's used for shock. And I felt the same way about the opening of It. I was actually looking forward to seeing it because I knew that it was going to have that moment and it was going to kind of address the queerness. But I don't think the movies, both of them, addressed it enough, because even in the book, there's gosh, I can't remember what the villain's name is off the top of my head.
Bauer?
Bully. Yeah,
Oh, Henry Bowers.
Yeah, is also like running away from his own queerness. So I think that if they were going to use the opening scene of chapter 2 and then the character kind of grappling with his own sexuality in the movie, that they probably should have fed it throughout instead of using it as shock moments or a moment of emotional manipulation.
Okay, so I let's pull that piece back and have a conversation about like, what is the responsibility of media to not just feature queer characters, but also to give them like meaty storylines or meaningful storylines? Like, are we content as viewers who identify from the LGBTQIA spectrum? Are we content to simply say like, there's my gay best friend, or there's like the trans girl that I said hi to in the hallway one time? Like, is that enough, or do we need to be front and center in these narratives? If it's the opening kill, does it need to have reverberations throughout the rest of the film or the show or something like that?
I feel like we talk about this so much, you know. I'm more lenient when it comes to like, what is it? I'm more like, it's the audience's job to do some extra work here. I'm very much the movie cannot do all the work for us. I'm sorry. And so when it's coming into queer characters, like, we can talk about the stereotype about the effeminate gay man all the time, right? Like, that is always the stereotype. But at the same time, I'm like, well, but those do exist. Like, those, it's not like this is like, it's a stereotype for a reason. Now, granted, I'm like, but I'm aware that there are other types. Not everyone is. So it's like, okay, well, so then, yeah, how much do I want to say, well, it's the movie's fault for not teaching these people? But then I go into that line where it's like, okay, but I don't want them to over-explain this to me, because then I feel like I'm being like an after-school special of watching something, and I don't know. So I go back and forth. It's very much a case-by-case basis for me.
I suppose so too, but you know, I guess depending on my mood, sometimes I'm not willing to just give people like a pass or a hand wave, because you know, we're in 2022, not 1992. So like we're not having like this is our gay episode of the week, you know what I mean? Our TSA episode, you know. So, I mean, I think that ship has sailed as far as just like, oh, hey, broke wrist, you know what I mean? And keep moving. Like, I think that's over and done with. I think obviously when we're talking about like kind of pulling back, we obviously need more representation of just like who's in our umbrella. Like, oftentimes we just, for example, like we aren't getting enough non-white people. We aren't getting enough disabled characters. We aren't getting enough fat characters. Like, still, like, even if let's say we're ticking like the usual boxes, usually it's still in the like realm of like desirability politics. Yes. Even now, that like who's good looking, who's hot, who's got abs, who's I don't know, really rich, or I mean,
if we're thinking about your CW shows, right? It's like, yeah, we had great representation across Batwoman and Legends of Tomorrow, but they were all hot as fuck. It's like
they were, but they did blend races at least, so that was a plus.
This is true. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of Batwoman, it's the first show I think I've ever seen in my whole life. I'm 31. I'm 31 now. And it's the first time I've ever seen two Black women in a relationship. Like, neither of them died. Neither of them had like anything traumatic happen to them. Everybody supported their relationship. Everybody loved them. They had a business. Like, it was like the first show I've ever seen where it was just like, we love y'all, we support y'all, it's regular, it's normal. Like, so it's heartbreaking. So when I see the hashtags like Wildmore on the internet, I get it, because it's like, we had one and it's gone.
Well, okay. Well, what about when it's done by queer creators though? Because I'll posit this. What about Freaky? Because to me, that was the gay character in that movie is someone where I was like, I don't like this character very much. I mean, I like the character, but I was like, I'm tired of seeing this character. And that it was done by queer creators bothered me more than if it was done by straight creators.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the actor's non-binary, right?
Yes.
And speaking of, I have been seeing like a ton of like non-binary people getting work. Yeah. But I'm also looking out for that as well. Like, are they also representing as non-binary people like on script, or are they still being like single gendered? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like what is that representation like? And Even so, like, what kind of non-binary rep are we getting? So like always, I'm just like, they're like margins within the margins. So I'm always just like, come on, people, let's be creative, you know?
Well, to your point, Trace, for me with Freaky, it didn't bother me so much just because I feel that if you are a queer creator, then you don't owe anyone to like make the kind of queer content that is supposed to be, you know, good or non-problematic or whatever. And I'm thinking about in particular because I talked to Eric Larocca, who is a writer, and he you know, he's written, one of the things that like got really big was Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, his novella that was released last year and is getting re-released in a bigger press this year. And he's written a lot of his characters are typically queer. They're typically problematic. They're typically kind of in a lot of ways. They're not likable
characters in a lot of ways.
And like there was
messy characters,
messy people. And he had a lot of like backlash when Things Have Gotten Worse came out, because a lot of people were saying these characters are problematic, or you know, you're moving into the queer villain aspect of it and that kind of stuff. And honestly, if you're a queer person, you're making horror, you create the kind of horror that you want to see. And so I have that problem when I see straight people do it, but I don't necessarily have it when I see queer people do it personally.
It's our sliding scale, right?
But I get that. But here's my thing, and because what and this is, again, maybe I'm working on my issues with the queer community in general, because my issue is I get where you're coming from, but then the problem is when we have straight creators or non-queer creators making queer content or content with like queer people, then our complaint is, well, you shouldn't be doing this because you're not queer, so you don't have that informed opinion of that lifestyle. So just stay away from that. And so I'm like, okay, well, where's the middle ground here? Like, what can we do?
I mean, I don't hold that view. I know that is a prevailing view among the queer community, but I don't hold that view. I don't know, maybe it's because I was closeted for so long that we don't know the person's sexuality, first and foremost. And second of all, I mean, I think that if you are a straight person, you're making queer content, then you really owe it to the queer community to do the work. Yes, to do the work, to have you know, someone from the queer community reading your stuff, you know, vet it through the community and make sure that you're telling things correctly. That's more important to me than having something written by straight people, because by the end of the day, more queer content is more queer content.
Right. Good example of this, actually, and I don't know if Sam Levinson is queer in any shape, way, or form.
He isn't. I know he has a wife. I don't know how he identifies.
Well, so him working with Hari Neff on Assassination Nation, like he worked with her to build that character in the script, and that's a trans character.
Yeah. I'm. So I'll put my 2 cents in, and then Dani, I want to hear from you. But like Trace and I, we've had a lot of these kinds of conversations, and I feel like part of this is that when we start to talk about like problematic characters or villain queer characters or underdeveloped queer characters, I think part of this stems from the fact that we're still just not seeing enough of ourselves on screen, that especially things like Freaky, right, where it's that mainstream, it went theatrical. Obviously, it was sidelined by the pandemic partially, but like that was a big film and people were excited for it because we were finally going to get to see ourselves in a blockbuster. And so everybody wanted that to be everything. And of course, one film can't possibly achieve that. One TV show cannot achieve that. So it's like we need to have our problematic Eric Larocca characters so that we can also have the happy Batwoman couple, so that we can also have the straightforward gay best friend who, you know, we would all maybe like to have seen do a little bit more in Freaky. But it's just like we're still like, well, I can count on one hand the diversity in, like, I need to see more so that we can start accepting different types of characters.
Yeah, we've always been like very touchy about like our villains, right? Like it's funny, we love our camp ones, we love like our fun ones, we love our like what's that?
Our Disney ones.
Yes. See, like they're like the template. And it's funny because we know that a lot of people who wrote those characters or drew those characters were gay themselves, right? So like now that we have that knowledge, like those are the reasons why we're able to like they ping immediately.
Yes.
So what were you going to say, Trace?
But that is the thing though, right? Like, are we owed to know the creator's sexuality in order to properly analyze the content. Now, granted, I don't think we need it. Now, if we know it, is that great? Does that add to our analysis of it? Yes. But I don't think anyone owes it. It's the same thing when we're talking about any kind of life experience. Again, do the creators owe us their, especially if it comes from trauma, right? Like, do they owe us like their history of trauma to justify telling a story about trauma? And I feel similarly about queer content.
It's funny because obviously it's now concluded, but Pose is like it's probably like the shining crown example as far as like a mainstream show that like blew up and got awards, and everybody like got to see all of these like Black and Afro-Latino like people, and even like the layers of, you know, the white gay community and how there's problematic undercurrent in there, but then like also like the allies across you know, all the arms, you know, like the lesbians who were there, like the whole kind of community that in the 80s and 90s was, you know, was trying to create this movement of solidarity and realizing that like we're all in this together. Like if we don't, like, you know, we gotta get it together, you know what I mean? But what's really beautiful about that show is when you were talking about like villains and even like interiority, what I loved about that, because it was a series, we got to see the layers, we got to find the interiority, we got to become ingratiated into the world and everyone's lives. But I think also just like as queer people, we don't automatically just kind of paint people with the brush of evil or like cattiness or whatever, because we know that there's always like that's coming from somewhere. That doesn't just like appear out of thin air. That usually like that's our armor, you know what I mean, to like snap and like kiki and whatever, you know what I mean? So like you know, Pose is a great example, and what are some others I'm thinking of? I know we're going to bring up more, but like it's one I can think of like right off the bat that was working with all of those complex layers that you were talking about.
Again, I'm sorry. We're just out of horror. We're just in queer media at this point. Like HBO's looking. I think did gay men really, really well. Oh, Joe, you disagree?
No, I think it did a subset of gay men very well. But I think if you know the demographic layout of San Francisco, that film was exceedingly white. And it got huge, like, you know, the same with like the way that we talk about Buffy, where you're like, you are telling one story, but you're also overlooking a huge component that possibly could have augmented or maybe expanded your storytelling prowess if you had been more inclusive. But the problem, right, like this is what we keep coming back to, is these asterisks of like, well, this is great, but, and you know, this could have been fantastic, like, and I don't know. I hate to be the Debbie Downer who's always criticizing things because they're not good enough, but I feel like it's just because we could still be doing better.
It's kind of the same thing for me though when we talk about problematic things from the 80s, right? Where I'm like, to me, like, yes, we can discuss that aspect of looking or whatever thing we're talking about and still say though, but I still really like it. I still think it's a really good show. If you think that, I'm just acknowledging something, but it's not like I'm like, oh, fuck this show because of it. And
we have to burn it to the ground. We can never talk about it again.
And I do feel like there's sometimes we as a community like to latch on that train when something isn't exactly what we want from representation. And so I'm playing devil's advocate in this recording a lot because I'm just like, but I also I get like we're not perfect either.
Well, and I've been thinking about this since we started talking about, you know, representation and seeing ourselves, and the idea of you know, freaky, for instance. I mean, for the longest time, until I saw Happy Endings, I never saw a queer person that was kind of like me. Right. You know, it's so I think that there's something to be said about the fact that we just need more. I think we need more diversity in characters, so that when something is like freaky, that has a character that doesn't necessarily represent us or that we don't necessarily like, we have 20 other things we can go look at. Exactly. And I think that's the problem, is that if you're a straight audience, if you don't like this movie, you have another 20, 30, 40, 50 that you can go watch instead. Whereas for us, because of it's still kind of a niche thing, and I honestly think that things are improving. I went through like a lot of list of movies that I've seen in the last 2 years, or mainstream events like Yellow Jackets, for instance, that have like a little bit more diversity in terms of character. I think until we see that as being like we have more options, I think we're still going to always be disappointed.
Well,
because right now it's with every minority character, especially when they're starting to be introduced. We need that character to represent all these quadrants of our experience, and that's just not going to happen.
That makes sense though, right? Because I feel like we like, again, whenever the next thing is here, it's like, okay, we're putting everything on this one thing because we don't have a lot of other things. So once we have a lot of other things, we'll start putting so much weight on each, like the next thing that comes out.
And it's funny, right? Because we could easily, like, I'm sure we could each pull up a list and be like, here's 20 things that I've watched in the last year. Like, we've been name dropping things from all over, like the TV landscape, the film, big mainstream releases, and streaming. But I feel like if you compare that to the media output in general, like all of these massive lists that we're going to be able to produce are still like a drop in the bucket.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is why I get so frustrated when people are like, oh, well, why does there always have to be a queer character in every show now? And I'm just like, because we need our piece of the fucking pie. That's why. Like, I want to see an accurate representation of our community, because those numbers are still not there, even though, yes, we have been doing better.
The difference is too, those people that are complaining about it are not doing it because they're like, oh, this is a shoehorned in gay person, because it doesn't fit the story. They're just doing it because it is a queer person. Whereas for us, if we're like, oh my God, why is this here? It's because, oh, this feels shoehorned in. Like your Disney ones.
That part. Grunt.
Like, 2 men touched hands. That's your gay stuff. There you go.
You know, speaking of Disney, I have to bring up like my show that I've gotten invested in. So like animation has always been like one of my favorite mediums. And like, I don't know if you all watch the Owl House. It comes on Disney Channel. It's one of the best shows that I can think of that's out right now that is like obviously sprinting with the torch, like after like Steven Universe and let me see, like what are some other ones that I can think of, but let me see, after like Gravity Falls, and in that same vein, what's another one I'm trying to think of?
Adventure Time, is that one?
Adventure Time. Thank you so much. Adventure Time. But like the Owl House is like the only like animated show, and like even like for it to be an animated show is one of the only shows I can think of where like people in the world, in the universe, are actively like two main characters like dating, going through a relationship. It's not like a problem. It's more like obviously they're teens and they're like nervous to like tell each other that I like you. But then like once that happens, like there's no big to do, like the world doesn't fall apart, like like the story continues. There's a non-binary character in it, like pretty much like every kind of like queer individual that you can think of. And the fact that sci-fi, fantasy, like horror. Bad news is Disney is like, oh, this doesn't fit our brand. And like the overlayers with like the Don't Say Gay bill, and like, so Dana Terrace, the creator of the show, was basically like pigeonholed into basically cramping as much as she could into the tail end of where the story is going to cut off. So basically they did not give her any more, like her and the animators, any more like seasons to work with. So basically what we have right now, and then like I think some super duper ultra long, maybe like 90-minute special episodes, but then that's it. So like there was like a huge tweet, like Dana Terrace is basically like, F Disney, like I could care less about like what happens to me by saying this, but like this show matters. Like the children matter, the people who love the show matter, the animators matter. Like Dana was a real one for that. And it was like, oh snap, like you went against the mouse. Like, I mean, look out. That with
Love Victor, right? Whenever Love Victor was premiering, they were like, it was supposed to go to Disney Plus. It's like, oh, this doesn't fit our family content, but because of the fact that it was queer. And that's actually a whole plot point in that show. When it's like his mother's like, oh, but this isn't good for families. And she's like, by saying it's not for families, you are saying that me being gay is immediately not good. And that is honestly the hump I want to like get over. I'm like, no, you can have a queer character in a show, and it's not about their sex life. It's just about their identity, and it can still be for families.
Well, I think with the kind of happy ending to that story, though, is that the final season is going to be on Disney Plus, and they're bringing all 3 seasons to it now.
Yeah.
I mean, they saw it and they're like, okay.
Well, but it's also, that's the thing, right? it's very frustrating when you start to get into these ideological battles about like, okay, so queer means that it's automatically for adults because it's going to be highly sexualized content or inappropriate for kids and families. And you're just like,
yeah.
I mean, we are political creatures. Like that's why we're having this conversation. That's why we're talking about representation, the kinds of content that we're looking for. But it's also, it feels like another extension of people trying to limit or control our bodies and our very existence, right? So when you say, well, you can't be on Disney because you're not family appropriate, it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess you're disgusting and terrible, and nobody who fits into quote unquote a desirable model wants to see you on their TV screens. Like, well, that just makes me feel great.
Which, granted, the straights did have this issue too with that Liz McGuire reboot, because they were really worried that Liz McGuire was going to be like just fucking her way through New York. But
I mean, Disney is basically just sex-phobic. Yes, and thank you, Trace, for fitting that in.
Now, what's funny, and maybe the irony is, I believe that obviously ABC Family, which was owned by Disney, right? Yes. ABC Family became Freeform, which is still under the Disney umbrella, right?
Yep.
Now, what's interesting is, if you all know Freeform, there's like yes, right? So I'm like, wait a minute, what?
But they removed the word family from their channel name. That's why.
Just that easy. The change, wave
it's
of a wand.
Freeform. You're free to be who you are as long as it's not called ABC Family.
Yeah, right. Like there is like hella queer content over there. Like for real.
I mean, I think part of it, like maybe what we can do is shift and start to think a little bit about some of the marketing for these films and like who the audience, quote unquote, is for them, right? Because I think the difference between something like Disney and Hulu versus Freeform is that they are being marketed towards like sexy teenagers and adults compared to like Disney, which is
teenagers, Joe.
Sexy teenagers. Only sexy teenagers can watch Freeform.
Wow.
But I mean, okay, so here's my question. So we're seeing more queer characters, we're seeing more queer creators and like publicly identified, I think, thanks to the rise of things like social media. Who is the audience for these projects? Is it still mainstream, or do you think they're like trying to double dip, or do you think they're making content for us that if it happens to work for the larger population, that's cool?
It's not horror, but I'll be curious to see how Bros does. Bros is an upcoming romantic comedy.
That's the Billy Eichner one.
Billy Eichner.
We also have Fire Island coming.
Fire Island, yeah. I will tell you though, I've seen that Fire Island trailer about 5 times, and every time I watch it, I hate it a little bit more.
It's a comedy. Like the problem is jokes get old, right?
Well, no, it's a thing where I'm like, oh my god, like these are like the humor that I'm seeing in the Fire Island trailer, which I haven't seen the film, so maybe the film is better, and that'll be also when we're talking about the marketing of a film versus what the film actually is. But like, there's jokes where I'm like, oh, this just feels like it's aimed towards straight people, but also not. Like, I don't know. Again, like I'm annoyed by all of these characters right now. But maybe that's my internalized homophobia peeping out. I don't know.
You know what's interesting? Oh, go ahead, Joe.
I will just say this. I think it's also like they're aiming at a particular demographic because they're talking about like coastal people, right? We sometimes, not to get ourselves into trouble, but there is like an LA kind of group, and there is also like a New York Fire Island kind of group.
And then there's us in the middle.
And there's us in the middle. All of us in the middle.
They get ignored on a constant basis.
Yeah. I love that, by bringing up this conversation about marketing, that now we know intimately that things do not live and die by marketing anymore. No. That, like the power of social media is so strong. Like word of mouth is like, when I say word of mouth, obviously that means like who you know in your circles, and then obviously who you know in the broader like internet. But it seems like now like the internet is the most powerful like tool and strategy. People make these fan cams, people on Instagram, making these TikTok collages, like Twitter threads about different things. Like it seems like now like we don't need necessarily the big billboards in Times Square for everybody to know how amazing this thing is, or like we don't need every podcast time slot to be slipped in with like, watch this movie or watch this TV show.
Mhm.
But I think the industry is still figuring that out. So I think the industry is in a really, really big shift where they're like, there's again so many ways to reach people, and now and social media, yes, is a big one, but that's also really relying on a lot of word of mouth as opposed to the actual advertising you see on social media. So I don't know. I think they're just like, a lot of things you see, it's like, oh, throw it out there and see what sticks, you know? But then you also have movies that are like, people are like, I've never even heard of this thing. And it's like, okay, was it because the marketing budget was low, or are they just not marketing on the right channels? I don't know.
I think A24 is like a good example of like making these like bomb, crazy, stellar films that like may have marketing-ish, but like
they're getting playful. They're getting playful with their marketing, and I actually think that's a really good way for things to do it nowadays. Like it wouldn't have worked as well 20 years ago because it's like who would have understood it. But I think in this age of social media, things that are getting like even the stuff for bodies, I feel like has been pretty clever given what they've done so far. But that's also because it's very queer, by the way, but also about Gen Z. I don't know, about A24 is also a brand. It's built a brand, and to a point where it's like, I don't know, that's almost an anomaly for me, where I'm like, I don't know if you can compare anything else to what A24 is doing right now, both in terms of their film output and in terms of how they market their films.
But I think one of the interesting things is like, okay, so let's try to keep this queer if we can. Let's try to keep it horror if we can. Yeah. So think about, we had a previous discussion about A24 films that people can go back and listen to, obviously with other guests. But, you know, Dani and Terry, I'm interested if I say, how would you rate the queer content or the queer horror content coming out of A24 versus Blumhouse? I feel like you're going to have very different responses to that, right?
Yeah.
You know what? This is also, we probably should have brought this up too, where let's say where we have in the film a queer reading versus like an affirmed like you know queer individual like on screen, and like some of our like most favorite like horror films may not have an affirmed queer individual, but it's a queer reading. So like
text versus text.
Yeah. So like Hereditary, for example, was one of like the biggest horror films, even outside of horror. Everybody was like, gosh, that movie was amazing, and had like this really like queer, like trans reading to it with the brother and the sister. But like we picked that up, did the masses necessarily, but like once we put that out there, everybody's like, oh yeah, I guess I could see that. You know what I mean? And like Blumhouse, it's like also like, well, you know, we may have some queer characters in there, but like, what is the quality? Is it making us think? Is it
well, that's the thing though, because so if I'm thinking Blumhouse queer, I think of Freaky, so there's that, but I also think there's that random like ex-boyfriend in Happy Death Day, or there's the gay Asian character whose only plot is, oh, my dad doesn't know I'm gay, and then he gets killed. So they're there, but I'm also like, oh, but I don't think that these are really good emblematic of or Fantasy Island where tattoos secret like gay at the end or whatever. Like I mean, they're doing work, but it's also not really the work I want to see. Whereas again, like I mean, I know Bodies doesn't come out yet. It's like a future A24 release compared to what's already come out. But there's more stuff there where I'm like, this is what I want to see than what I've seen mostly from Blumhouse's output.
Yeah, that's why like when I heard about they/them, I was like, if this is messy and problematic, get ready for a read, because
I mean, we are talking about a queer creator, so it's John Logan, the guy the individual behind Penny Dreadful. But so also by
Terry's rules, we got to give him a pass.
Penny Dreadful was great.
This is when Terry's like, "Fuck you all, I'm leaving the chat." But I mean, I'm intrigued by that one because it's explicitly set in the U.S., but we're talking about a British creator.
I'm just fucking with you, Terry. You know that,
I know you are. Yeah. I know. I got nothing to say to that though. It's like, you're right.
Like, I know. You got me.
Right for Phil.
I was going to say, and this is now a reading challenge, and we shall all take turns putting on Dani's glasses.
Fundamental.
But I also think with they/them, it's also, I mean, this is trans and non-binary people, and I think there's also, I mean, that's a bit more sensitive than if it was just, just gay men and lesbians. If that, I don't know, maybe I'm dipping into wrong areas there.
Well, no, I mean, we know politically the history behind the treatment of the trans community is far worse than anything that our cis counterparts are getting. So as a result, it's like, to me, that's actually still where I see the future of queer horror. It's what I said when I submitted an unlikely attempt to be part of Shudder's queer horror documentary. I literally said, like, I would like to see more trans characters in my queer horror, because that is, I think it's still being treated like the final frontier. Like what we see in real life is still more horrifying than any queer horror we're seeing on screen. And I think that people pick up on that treatment and they're like, okay, well, this is the final bastion. Like, we've done white gay men, but trans characters we still need to protect them in a way that I think people feel like they can create horror out of it, which sounds horrible as I'm saying it aloud.
No, but I get what you're saying with that aspect. I mean, it's a delicate line, and I think when we're dealing with a genre like horror, which goes into very dark places, I think it's more difficult. Like if we were talking about a trans rom-com, that would be a different story. Like there wouldn't be as many
please give me that.
No, but
in a way, that was kind of what Pose was in a lot of ways. But.
Yeah, but that's like a drama. It's also really sad, but it's also very funny. But if we're talking horror, like, yeah, there's a lot more proverbial landmines you could step on in that. Oh, yeah. But I'm also the mindset where I'm like, okay, but if you're a horror fan and you're consuming a lot of horror, I also feel like you have to kind of, again, not really give them a pass, but be like, you're working in a genre that deals with hurting humans and humans like in bad situations. So there's a discussion to be had there. I'm not saying give everything a pass, but like there's, to me, a bit more leeway in the horror genre when you're telling these kinds of stories.
And, like you mentioned, Joe and Trace, that the frontier is still so very new. I mean, like we still, like, as far as like visible trans people, like it is still so very, very small. Like it's still like a drop in the bucket. Like we still list like Assassination Nation, Bit.
Yeah.
Like I think there's probably a couple more.
It's still like one. Yeah, there's like a couple more. But like, as you said, like the frontier is still so very, very small. And
I do think we're seeing some films more explore the identity of like gender politics. I think Titan last year did it.
Titan, oh my goodness.
I think the Witchy movie that premiered at Sundance, You Won't Be Alone, has some interesting things to say about gender as like a witch that kind of inhabits multiple genders throughout the movie. So I think there's, but I think right now it's more of like subtextual reading than it is we're seeing a loud and proud trans character in a movie. So are there, I think in advance of this conversation, I asked each of you if you had like either one creator or one sort of movie that you felt was really doing the work or doing something great and meaningful that you maybe wanted to give a shout out. Trace is giving me the look that he did not do the homework. That's fine. Terry or Dani, was there anything in particular that you wanted to like shine a light on?
I'm just going to shout out the Owl House again, because I mean, like we've all mentioned, we remember being young and like having nothing, having the landscape just be desolate. So like whenever I see things coming out for like children and tweens, I'm always like, yay, y'all have, and like for it to be just like so like ordinary, everyday, just like regular, like where a lot of our sometimes adult content is still stumbling. I find that like the children's media is just like on point, like super on point, like super just like imaginative and carefree, like we want to be like. So like I'm going to shout out the Owl House because I know it's going to be ending, I think this year. And I hope people can catch up on it and just like get their life with it and enjoy all the goblins and wizards and elves and all that stuff. So
yeah, I felt like I was seeing a similar response with N.D. Stevenson's work on She-Ra, the Netflix series.
She-Ra. Yeah.
I mean, for me, I want to see more transgressive horror. I want to see more things that are like not necessarily mainstream. And that's why I mentioned him earlier, Eric LaRocca, the writer. I think he's doing some interesting work that I think people should follow. Last year, it's I would say it's horror adjacent. It's a movie that wants to be horror, but Bruce LaBruce's Saint Narcisse is doing a lot of transgressive stuff in it. And then there's some creators, and I don't think his movie is explicitly queer, but he is. The Outwaters. I think Robbie Banfish is doing some fantastic things within found footage that's moving along, and he is a queer creator.
It's really funny that you mentioned that, though, because I also didn't pick. I know he is a queer creator, but narratively, I didn't pick up on that. Whereas my husband watched it, he was like, "I feel like he wants to fuck his brother for this entire movie."
Oh, I forgot one. We're all going to the World's Fair.
Yeah.
By Jane Schoenbrunn. Did I say their name right?
Yes, but I would say, though, if you were not queer, I don't know if you would pick up on those undertones. I don't. I think it is doing the work, but it's not explicit enough to where I think if you were not already fine-tuned, or at least if you weren't already queer, you wouldn't pick up on, this is a story about gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and there's once again like that kind of like
how much work should the audience do versus the film. Exactly.
Yeah, totally what we've been hitting on.
But I kind of like that idea. Like I would love to just see more explicit, like, you can't fucking miss this if you have your eyes open and you're watching this movie or this TV show, because I do think we need politely to shove it in certain people's faces and just get them comfortable with normalizing queer characters. But I do also love these kind of like covert grenade films and TVs shows where it's like, yeah, if you're picking up on it, you're picking up on it, but also you don't need to in order to get what you need out of this property.
But see, I agree. But at the same time, if we're going to the audience here, then that's when we get the bloody disgusting commenters that are like, you're just trying to shoehorn queer content. Like, there's nothing queer about this. Like, you're just trying to make everything gay. And it's like, no, it's there. But like, if it's not explicit enough, it's like you got to bash them over the head with it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think we actually need more of both, more of all the things. But yeah, like, because I think if we've unfortunately had a long history, as Dani was suggesting, it's like, it's been a lot of subtextual. It's been a lot of like, the reading is there, but it's not actually like explicitly in the text. Yeah. And I think for too long, that was representative of a queer experience, right? Where we maybe couldn't be out and be safe, and we couldn't live our authentic lives. And hopefully now we're able to see more of it. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
We didn't touch on reality TV. Like, how did we like go this long without talking about Drag Race and Dragula? Like, two of like the biggest titans like going mano a mano like out there, as far as like getting all kinds of people to watch. Like, crazy. I know like even this weekend is DragCon, which is May well, for our viewers, this May 13th, 14th, 15th, is that right? Friday through Sunday.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Jimmy, with Dragula at least, which I still have not watched, but I will clearly try to watch it before the next round of this video series. But no, I've seen people that, again, like, they're just horror fans that aren't queer watching Dragula and be really impressed by it, and I'm like, good, like that should be it. Like that's something that I think is great. Yeah, indoctrinate them, not really, but
and what I love about these shows, I know that obviously they're reality TV and they're like scripted, and there's like there's a production going on, but at the same time, what I love about those shows is they are able to see all of the layers of these artists and these individuals. So like, it gives people who would never, I guess, think outside of the box that way, that like, oh, this is a character that they're doing, but like when they strip all that makeup away, they're still like this human being underneath. They're still like really talented, and like if they're able to create this character, they've got this mind going on. And what I love is throughout all of these shows that we're talking about, we're able to get all of this interiority with their family lives. We're able to find out like so much about like their lives and where they come from, and like it gives like the world this opportunity to be like, yeah, like that's why I relate with you, because the work is being done to humanize everyone, you know?
Yeah. I liked it too because it's a cyclical thing. So like if you get part of the casting, maybe I don't want to say wrong because we are talking about real human beings, but you can adjust. So like I think we're seeing like really good representation of like different body types, different personalities, people from different backgrounds. Like I'm kind of shocked at the number of like poor contestants that we have on Drag Race. I could it's a weird like juxtaposition because of course a lot of the time you have to have like hundreds of thousands of dollars in sponsorship to like make a dent in there with your costumes and all that kind of stuff. But you know, we get people talking frankly about growing up poor, growing up from, as Terry you said, like the middle part of the country or not the coast. And so I think if nothing else, that's giving us different perspectives on queer people and their artistry. And yeah, like whenever somebody shows up in a Freddy Krueger outfit and we all just get to die a little bit because it's so great.
And you know, it's powerful too. Like I know like for a long time Drag Race was like, oh, we don't know how to engage with our trans audience or trans performers, you know, but I mean the dam broke. Like it was just like literally like the trans tipping point. Like you can't like shut the door on like
this most recent season. We had like what 4 or 5 trans contestants on it. 5, yeah.
I mean, they weren't all out at the time, but I think by the end of the season, even like 3 of the 5 were. So it's pretty fucking good.
And then there's a straight guy.
And this,
and it was a straight guy.
And the straight guy.
I was fine. Look, Maddie had terrible fashion sense. I actually liked Maddie's asides. I liked her diary rooms. I liked her as a person.
Yeah.
She just wasn't a very good queen.
I don't know why we needed to take that spot away from a queer person when the straight people already get so much.
I'd be less bothered if they were less like objectifying of Maddie's straightness in the season, because that seems to be the only reason that she was there. And that was my problem. I don't have a problem with her being there, but the fact that seemed to be the only reason she was there was
her storyline is straight.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally. Someone said, "Oh, how can we write something even juicier?" Yeah,
so boring. Yeah, that was the other thing, is I was just like, you're taking time away from other people with more interesting stories. I'm sorry, straight person. Like the novelty is that you're straight and you do drag. That's not enough for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you want to put a straight person like on the show, fine, but like make it a reason, like give a reason for that instead of just straight.
Yeah, like this most recent season of Dragula, like I think the first cis woman like ever on the show. Gosh, I wish I could remember her name. Does anyone remember? No. Oh, well, incredible performer. And there was even a lot of reading into that they were a really incredible performer, but it also even kind of simmered and bubbled under the surface, like that kind of antagonism of like, this is a space that like usually like queer men have been in. What is this like now that like a cis woman is like breaching this space, and like all of that like gender play and stuff like that, like with a cis woman, like obviously doing a hyper feminine, sexualized, gory like drag. So like there was like a whole bunch of stuff that got unpacked this most recent season that I think with Drag Race and Dragula is like the first time we've like really started to unpack this stuff, like at least through our media. We've been talking about this stuff like on social media forever, in our circles forever, but like it's the first time that I think probably straight people are like, is that a problem? Like they're like knock knock knock, like we're just checking, are you all okay? I'm like, no, are you all okay?
Well, okay, so I think with this we started with horror, but we really branched out into media in general. So I think, Joe, even for like our part 2 of this, we'll narrow down the focus to horror. But I think this was a really, really good beginning to this discussion. A primer to this, because I think we start wide and we kind of narrow that focus down. But this was fascinating. I think we all have some similar opinions, but also obviously some different opinions on these things. I think that was actually really good to get out.
Yeah. So if folks want to hear more of your fantastically informed opinions, Terry, we'll start with you. Where can they get a hold of you on social media?
You can find me at Gaily Dreadful on Twitter and Instagram, and I guess I'm on TikTok, but
I say maybe not, but
I'm not even on TikTok.
Yeah, I'm not either.
The time, the energy, no, thank you. But,
No.
okay.
Maybe I'm too old for TikTok. I don't know. That ship sailed for me.
I'm
kids
41.
have it.
I don't understand it. I'm like, I don't get it, but I'm here.
Yeah, I've been there and done that with Vine and everything else. Like,
Oh God. And Dani, if people want to get a hold of you.
you can find me on Twitter at the Dani Bethea. All of my links are there to all of my writing and everything else. So I'll let that be the passageway that you can find me.
Fantastic. Okay, well, until part 2 of this discussion on the state of queer horror, we'll wrap up another Horror Queers Hangout. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Yes.
Thank you
Thank you
guys
so much.